Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I have a really, really great episode for you today. I have my friend on here, Dr. Rebekah Diamond, who is a pediatrician, and she has written two incredible books for parents. I love them so much. So I had to have her on when her second book came out because it's called Eat, Sleep, Tantrum, Repeat. So before I jump into sort of all the beautiful wisdom in this book and why you guys are going to want to grab this book, because it's literally a roadmap of exactly what you want to do if you have a toddler, I just want to introduce Dr. Diamond. Dr. Diamond, thank you so much for being here.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for having me and that kind introduction. I'm so excited to be
Yeah, I
here.
think you and I met when through the Detroit Writing Room, and they were doing the author series when your first book came out, Parent Like a Pediatrician, and I loved that book so much, and I wanted to just kind of start with that only because I think it leads so nicely into this book. And I think it's important that people know what type of pediatrician you are, for a lack of better words. So I was thinking on this, and I thought back to when my kids were younger, and when I would go to the pediatrician, I was really selective about who I ended up staying with. And in part, it's because I felt like there was this performative aspect to going to the pediatrician where you had to say everything was like kosher or good or right. And so if anything wasn't, you were like panicked and scared, and you felt kind of judged, even if that wasn't their intention. And I loved your book because I think when you became a parent too, you kind of coupled these two worlds of research and being a pediatrician and having all the knowledge that you do about children, and then also looking at it through the lens of a parent and going like, oh, okay, I understand now why maybe there's a little bit of a disconnect between a parent coming into the pediatrician's office and maybe not feeling seen or heard, or maybe not being able to connect on some of those true points that are really, there might be really be struggling with. So kudos to you for that. So I wanted to kind of paint that picture because I think it's really important that people know that you are bridging those two worlds. And I think that's what most people really need. There's like a lot of great research in your books, but you're also like, hey, by the way, guys, I had to take my baby and we did have to co-sleep, but here are all the safe ways that we did it when she was an infant, and, things of that nature. So anyways, I just wanted to put that in there because I felt like it was such an important part. And I think it sets it up for your second book, which is all about tantrum, or all about toddlers. So I want to start there. And you talk about this really nicely in the book, but why do you think the toddler phase of development is so trying for parents? Like, what is developmentally happening and what is the parent sort of experiencing?
Yeah, thanks for summarizing my whole philosophy in first book, honestly, so well. So seriously, because I really view myself, like you said, as that liaison between the world of sort of very rigid, um, usually research-based parenting advice that comes from pediatricians, but also sort of the wild west of the internet that has some good information and some realistic information, but kind of it just has all sorts of different stuff mixed in there, maybe pseudoscience, maybe stuff that just isn't quite exactly right. And so it was just kind of a big beast to tackle when I was doing the first book, coming at it from the perspective of a pediatrician and parent, first time mom who was super overwhelmed, just didn't even know where to start. It's that whole you're drinking from a fire hose. You don't know how to keep this creature
Mhm.
safe. You don't understand basic things like sleep and feeding, and everyone's giving you a million different things, and you're exhausted and your body hurts. And by the time you get to the toddler years, I'm glad that my book put out some advice that really helped you get through the infant years and you've pieced it all together. But it feels almost like you're kind of abandoned all over
Mhm.
again. It's this whole new milestone where, the battles are very different and maybe they're less acute. Maybe it's not like, oh my God, how do I feed every 3 hours? How do I make this decision every 3 hours? I'm not seeing the pediatrician every few months, so I'm not making choices about checkups, and I'm not getting vaccines every few months. It doesn't feel maybe as nonstop and acute as you're interfacing with the medical
Mhm.
system and as you're interfacing with these decisions. But the everyday is sort of this kind of like constant change that you're dealing with, this state of sort of calm chaos, perpetual
Mhm.
chaos, where you have this totally dysregulated, and evolutionarily correctly dysregulated toddler. You have this really out of control being that is supposed to be out of control, that you're not meant to control, but you're meant to sort of guide on this journey. And I found a different sort of lack of advice that came across. So it wasn't that there weren't people telling me what to do about my toddler. There's always someone telling you
Mhm.
what to do, for better or worse. But the kind of advice you were getting was very like rigid in a different way, I might say. There was a lot of trends in parenting saying that you have to deal with tantrums exactly like this. You need to use this parenting
Mm-hmm.
philosophy. There wasn't a lot about sort of sleeping and eating from a more research-based perspective. There was a lot of opinions. It was sort of a whole new mess to tackle, I
Yeah.
might say. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but there was a different sort of lack of reason. It wasn't all just about, is there pseudoscience or is there science? Is there realistic stuff or is there unrealistic? There was just a whole mix of new information that was completely overwhelming and sort of, unrealistic in its own way. And so I just decided parents need to understand that they know how to raise their kids, right? They know how to be parents. You know how to do this, but you still need some basic background and some basic information. And so I tried to put together whatever research we have, but also really highlight that, your parenting style, your parenting confidence is really important too.
Yeah.
And you can take what advice is helpful. You can use whichever scripts and philosophies are helpful, but you don't have to let it cause stress. And there's no research that says that you have to be a quote unquote conscious parent by the book. There's lots of research that says that if you feel confident in what you're doing and you've looked at all the information and made the best choices, that your kid will do well too, right? Because your own self-efficacy as a parent, which is your parental kind of confidence, is actually going to translate to your kids. But just there's no evidence that you have to do anything a specific way. There are, however, a list of safe, reasonable options. There are tools that you can use. And I really wanted to put that all in one place so that you know where to start rather than just scrolling like I was
Yeah,
doing.
absolutely. And I think it's really empowering because I think you do lend, or the book lends itself to this idea that like you are steering the ship. Like you are still the one who is divinely connected to your child, right? Like they're your child. You get them better than anybody. When I was a pediatric speech and language pathologist, I worked in an outpatient center right outside of Detroit, and I loved it. I just left my job at the end of May, and I miss it, for a lot of different reasons. But the work I'm doing right now with parents has really been expanding, and it's been a really nice kind of transition. But when I would do evaluations for children who were either presenting as speech delayed, or they might have had other medical diagnoses. In some cases, they had, they were medically fragile for different reasons. There were a lot of different things going on, but I always kind of reminded the parent, like, you know them better than anyone, right? Like you're the one who really gets your child. I'm going to support you through some of these other areas of development, but remember, like it's a team effort. Like we're going to sort of get through this like I'll share some of my expertise, but you are the expert on your child. Like that's the thing I don't know. So like when we can come together on that, we will be able to make really great gains. So let's talk parenting styles, because I think that I loved the way you approached it in the book. And it's the exact same philosophy I use both when my background's in early childhood development. I was a preschool director for 12 years. Then I went and taught, and then I went on to become a pediatric speech therapist and worked on the medical side of things, leaving the schools. And I think one of the things I find is like people want to like box into one type of parenting style. And I've worked with so many kids, and I can tell, I mean, thousands at this point, and whatever you think about one specific way of doing something, often you have to be flexible and be willing to pivot depending on the child's needs. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of all these different parenting styles and how a parent can sift through it? So there's like gentle parenting, there's positive parenting, there's attachment theory, there's so many different things. But what's sort of the best road to take?
Yeah, it is so overwhelming. And I think that kind of underlies a lot of the struggles when you transition into the toddler
Yeah.
phase. Because as I was saying, when you're in the infant phase, you're just trying to make some basic, safe, healthy, reasonable choices to get
Hmm.
through it. By the time you get to toddler time and you have this more human, fully formed creature in front of you, a lot of the advice that's coming at you isn't necessarily about the exact decisions you should make for eating and sleeping and things like that. Although I made sure to put plenty of those options
Hmm.
in the book. But it's really about this idea of like your parenting style and who you are and your identity as a parent. And I think, the question of what is your style is a good one, but the answer of kind of choosing some sort of
Hmm.
allegiance, almost, I think it's the wrong answer to that question because as you create your own parenting style, it has to be your
Yeah.
own. It needs to be something that comes from you and is a synthesis of kind of all the information and tools you've been given. Um, but, the idea that there's just going to be kind of one team or one brand or one thing that you can dive into, I think becomes more of a problem than a help. Now, that being said, I don't want to just be a hater and say, don't look at those styles, don't look at the good that they've done, because as always, I like to ask
Mm-hmm.
why do we even have these
Mm-hmm.
things out there? If they're not good, if they're not helpful, why is there something called mindful or gentle or conscious parenting? And I think one thing that really helped me as I was researching the book and talking to parents and looking through the history of everything is, well, they came for a reason, which is that, back in the bad old days, as recently as last century, 1950s or even earlier, there was a lot of sort of more strict, uncaring, untouching, unloving parenting that started to predominate. And we all talk a lot, Gen Z and even old geriatric millennials like myself talk about our trauma and the different types and ways in which maybe neglect or suboptimal talking about our emotions has impacted things later. So the idea of a conversation about, do you need some sort of attachment? Do you need some sort of mindfulness? Do you need some sort of emotional intelligence? That's a good
Mm-hmm.
conversation, right? Like, we want to talk about how we can create a healthier model for our kids. And so I really think the groundwork that was laid by some of these parenting philosophies is a good one, right? There are people who've done a lot of writing and a lot of research to show that you do need loving, touching connection with your kids in order to create good attachments. You do need some sort of mindfulness where you check in on your own
Mm-hmm.
behaviors and thinking. And that's, I'm in no way trying to sort of minimize or
Yeah.
denigrate the importance of that. But if that goes the next step of, okay, here's the exact words you have to use, or here's the exact response you have, or here's what your dyad specifically needs to look like, then we have to say, okay, well, that doesn't make sense, right? Because you don't know me, you don't know my child. Also, the words that I use that come from myself are always going to be better than the words that someone
Mm-hmm.
else's use. They can give me suggestions, but if it's a specific interaction and I say something that comes genuinely from me and I feel good about it, doesn't really matter the exact content of those words. That's going to be better than if someone told me exactly what to say. And so I think, it's all to say that, is there a way that we can take the themes and the good guidance from some of these approaches without deciding that we have to wear like parenting philosophy jerseys or, you know,
Pick a
make
team.
ourselves fall into these
Yeah.
mold, right? It, you know, I would much rather see parents decide again, oh, I feel confident about what I'm doing. I see what the research shows. I know the basic principles. I have some basic tools, but this is my parenting, right? This is Rebekah style. This is my Rebekah philosophy of parenting. It's not quote unquote mindful parenting.
Exactly.
It takes in different parts of things. And that's a much heavier lift in a lot of ways. It's harder to do that kind
Mm-hmm.
of work. But I did find once I started doing that kind of work and trying to let some of the other noise go away, things got a little
Yeah.
simpler and easier, right? Because I could trust myself and I didn't have to feel this sense of doubt and, insecurity. And that translates too to your kids.
Yeah.
So again, it's a heavier lift, and it takes a little bit of work and a lot of tuning out of noise. But I'm really hopeful that by sharing kind of the good and helping parents be a little wary of the harmful parts of all this stuff, that parent, I know they can do a great job, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Parents are great.
absolutely. I love all of that. And I couldn't agree more. It's really this idea of like tuning into sort of what you need, what your child needs, what feels natural and good to you in terms of how you want to set certain boundaries or what your family values are, or what you can kind of know if your child's having a hard day. And maybe that's not the day that we want to do a really prescriptive kind of, rule based
Right.
parenting approach. So I agree with you, sort of really being able to kind of lean into this idea of flexibility, I think is so key. So the book is broken up into 3 sections, which I love. And I think it's the beauty of it is like if you're a parent of a toddler, you can flip to a section and jump to a chapter so quickly. And you've synthesized the information in such a nice way that I think it's really doable for a lot of parents to be able to use it as a great resource. So I want to start with the first section. You have behavior and development, and then I think it goes into eating and sleeping, and then health and society. So they're all so valuable and for different reasons. So most of the parents that I work with often start with some type of either behavior challenge, and often it's tantrums. Like it's sort of where it begins, and that kind of idea of emotional dysregulation and how do we build self-regulation skills. So can we start there and let's unpack tantrums, because I you and I share really similar the way we define it and the way we look at it, which you outline in the book. But talk to me a little bit about how we would walk a parent through that tantrum phase, and like help them get through it in some kind of a sane way.
Yeah, no, this is a great example of how being a mom completely changed my counseling and and everything I do. I as a pediatrician was sort of taught a few different ways that you could approach a tantrum, whether it was just ignoring it or whether you would, make a big deal out of it in a certain way. I don't know. There was a few different approaches that you could use, and none of them ended up being what worked
Yeah.
for me. And it took me a long time to kind of get my specific approach. And I try to share that and give as much helpful guidance with the caveat that you're going to have to adapt this, right? Your kid is different. But before I get into sort of the specifics of how to deal with the tantrum, I think one thing that's often missing from tantrum guidance is understanding what they are, why they happen, and why not only are they normal, but they're kind of well, they're
Yeah.
necessary, they're
Mm-hmm.
adaptive, right? We talked a lot about this child who has no self-regulation, which is sort of the ability to filter emotions and change behaviors as needed based on these intense emotions. They're developing language, expressive and receptive at
Mm-hmm.
different rates. They're all of a sudden having all these expectations put on them. It might have been 2 months ago that they were allowed to just scream or run around or hit you. And now 2 months later, you're deciding, well, you're 1.5 now. You're a big boy. You're a big
Mm-hmm.
girl.
Yeah.
You can put on, you can wait till I get you that cup. You should be able to wait 10 seconds. So that's an eternity for a
Yeah.
kid who just 2 months ago wasn't doing that. So understanding that this is how they learn all of that, they have to get this
Mm-hmm.
out. No matter how perfectly you set the stage, there is no toddler who cannot have a tantrum. It would be honestly, though, that would be
Mm-hmm.
atypical and sometimes signaling
Mm-hmm.
something else, on the behavioral spectrum. So I think understanding that the tantrum, look, it sucks. No one
Mm-hmm.
likes it. It's horrible. It can be really horrible, especially when they're on the more intense and more frequent side, but it's necessary and natural.
Yeah.
That's really helpful because you're not necessarily trying to stop them. You may be able to get them to be less frequent, and you certainly can get through them with everyone a little more intact
Mm-hmm.
emotionally and
Mm-hmm.
physically. But you can't stop them, and you wouldn't want to. You need this kid to be able to create those brain connections and develop that sense of self regulation. That being said, they're terrible. So how do you get through it? I try to outline the guidance I've gotten from my favorite parenting people and my favorite tantrum and behavioral experts, because there's not a ton of a guidance that's going to be like, there was a huge randomized controlled
Mm-hmm.
study that says that you have to
Mm-hmm.
address tantrums. But there's science, there's common sense, there's the idea that you do want to respond to your child in general, right? It's not a strict, you can never walk away and calm
Mm-hmm.
down. If you're in a situation where you just have had it, of course you can do that. But I used to think you had to
Yeah.
ignore tantrums, and I used to be very behaviorist, meaning like there's cause and effect. And if you go to them, you'll
Mm-hmm.
reinforce it. And if you walk away, you won't. That's not really based on
Mm-hmm.
anything. That's an older way of thinking that's been pretty debunked by, again, common sense and experience, and just generally what we know about childhood development, which is that
Yeah.
they need guidance through these things. So the way I break it down in the book to try to be just like really practical and helpful after going through all that science is there are all the things you can do in the meantime before tantrums happen to start working on those emotional, self-regulation foundations. You can teach mindfulness to your kids in different ways. You can work on your own mindfulness. You can use different sort of tantrum preventing strategies, giving choices, redirecting behaviors in certain ways, distraction, humor. And then there are the things during the tantrum that are a little harder. There's, your options become more limited because it's mostly about getting to the end of it,
Yeah.
with a few boundaries, a few limits. You don't have to let someone hit
Mhm.
you. You don't have to be in a dangerous situation, screaming and thrashing themselves on the stair or running into a street. That's crazy. I've heard parents say, like, I'm not allowed to interrupt this tantrum, but they're going to fall down
Yeah.
the stairs.
No,
It's like,
no.
who told you? That doesn't make
Right.
any sense. Your first goal is to keep their body
Mhm.
healthy, right? Like, you're the parent. So again, it's where some of these really strict philosophies start to erode at our common sense of what's the big picture here? This kid's being an absolute rage
Mhm.
monster. Okay, that might be normal.
Mhm.
Sure, that's great. That's normal. That's healthy, but they can't throw themselves down the stairs. They can't slap me in the
Mhm.
face. I can hug them. They might just need to cry for 5 minutes and scream. It is what it is. And then after, we'll move on. Lessons learned, kind of start
Yeah,
over again.
absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I know I work with a lot of parents who are in the throes of it. And, the hardest thing for them to do, and you mentioned this in the book in one of your steps, but there is such a desire on the part of the parent to explain or justify the boundary that they're setting while the child is dysregulated.
Mm,
So it's something like, can I have ice cream before dinner? No, you can't, or a popsicle. And then the child becomes completely dysregulated for one reason or another. Maybe it's that they can't manage the emotion, they can't tolerate being told no, whatever, that is for that child. And they start to have a tantrum, and the parent is just over explaining and talking about like the health benefits of why we can't have the sugar before that, like all the things. And I get it,
yeah,
right? I totally understand, it's so well intended, but that actually causes them to escalate more. So I think the hardest thing for most of the parents that I work with is that, like, regulating yourself during the tantrum so that
100%.
you can stay calm is going to be such a game changer. I had Dr. Shafali on about 6 months ago, author of Conscious Parent, and she was saying, there's a lot of talk around this idea of like, you have to stay with the child, you have to stay with the child. If you need to walk away and collect yourself,
Yeah,
walk away. Like, they're going to be okay.
right,
It's all in
right.
your delivery. So if you're walking away and saying, you're so out of control right now, I can't be around you, I'm going to go downstairs and wait for you to stop, or I'm going to go in another room because you're too much. That's a different communication. If you say, you know what, I'm going to step out for a second and use the bathroom and I'll be back, that's a very
Right,
right. So it's
right.
all in sort of that, again, that intuitive knowing, that part of you that's going to say, what do they really need? What do I really need? But yeah, that tends to be the hardest thing, is like the idea of wanting to constantly communicate and stop the tantrum, right? I always say, like, we learn self-regulation by going through dysregulation. Like, if I want to learn how to get better at it, I actually have to experience it and then teach my body how to calm itself down. So I loved, yeah.
Exactly.
So let's
Exactly.
talk a little bit about, I wanted to kind of bridge that into consequences then, because I also think, like, how do we set boundaries and realistic boundaries? And you do a really great job in the book talking about how do we kind of develop developmentally appropriate boundaries and expectations. So I wanted to jump there and just kind of pick your brain a little bit about, what do natural consequences look like for a toddler?
Yeah. So consequences is another thing that, again, I worry sometimes that, like, the trends of the moment or the zeitgeist is sort of making things a little more complicated than they
Yeah.
need to be. And some of this is historical, right? You mentioned Dr. Shafali, whose research is so great and important, in her approach is showing, like, listen, we can't treat children like
Hmm.
dogs. Like, not to
Yeah.
oversimplify, but there was this trend of, cause and effect behavioral conditioning. If you don't want a behavior to happen, you
Hmm.
ignore it. If you want a behavior to stop, you
Hmm.
punish it. There was that in the parenting world really
For
for a
sure.
long time. And we've seen lots of movements like Dr. Shafali's, but also like Dr.
Hmm.
Spock, even, like people who came in and said, hey, maybe the parent child relationship isn't this
Hmm.
transactional conditioning, training, some sort of
Yes,
animal
Pavlovian. Yeah.
thing. Yeah, exactly. Maybe actually it's just about sort of staying connected, creating this realistic framework where you model what you want to see, where you give unconditional love, something a little more reasonable and mindful. And I
Hmm.
love that. So when that gets a little too extreme, though, which is what I've noticed, is the idea that you can't have any sort of, not even punishment, but you can't have any sort of discipline or
Right.
consequences, or or you have to just let your child express themselves without any sort of regard for the people
Mhm.
around them. And so what I think is important to reframe is, listen, the world has consequences, right? Like they are going to be a society in a society. They're going to go through life where if they punch someone in the face, which I hope they won't, but in a tantrum,
Mhm.
they will. They will probably hit you in the face. Someone's
Yeah.
not going to like that in life, and they shouldn't do that. Maybe they're doing it right now, and you're not going to punish them for that, per se, in the traditional sense of the word. But you can absolutely let them know that that's not acceptable. And I think, the story I use that really kind of let this all click in for me is that during peak pandemic, I was working on the front lines in New York City, and it was extremely stressful. And I was in my full crazy gear and had my N95
Mhm.
scars and migraines and
Mm.
whatever. The whole, just to set the scene that I happened to have a 2-year-old at home too. And it was just like so
Mhm.
exhausting to
So
come home.
exhausting.
So exhausting to come home after that day, run to the shower. We didn't really know what was going on. And then come down to see my child, who then would understandably have a tantrum because her life was, she would have had one maybe anyway, but her life was so unpredictable at that time, right? The schedule was changing every day. We were doing our best. We had visual schedules. We were trying to do this, but she didn't even know if who she was going to be with
Mhm.
watching that day. She had just had her daycare basically taken away and shut down. And she was just totally like doing her best. She was way more resilient than I was. But one time I came home, I was totally at my wit's end. She had a tantrum, and mid tantrum, flailing around, whatever, she slapped me, not intentionally, but she slapped me in the face, I think, just in her rage. And I remember being like, I'm going to scream. Like, I understand it for the first time, like why people yell
Yeah.
at their kids. But I didn't. I didn't. And I said, really hurts my feelings. And it really hurts me when you scream and hit me. And I was like, I'm the best parent ever. I did it. I control myself, whatever. Later, I'm scrolling through Instagram inexplicably. I'm scrolling through Instagram. And, I see a bunch of these like behavioral parenting script tip videos that come up. And I'm like, oh, I wonder. And I don't know if Siri was spying
Yeah.
on me that day or it was just coincidence, but it said, oh, did you just tell your child that they hurt your feelings when they did something or when they hit you? Don't do that. That's really bad
Mhm.
for them. You should say, wow, you must have had really big feelings to
Yeah.
to
Mhm.
do that. And I was just like, oh man, like I knew intellectually what I had done made sense in my situation, but I just started
Mhm.
crying
Yeah.
because I was just like, I'm really doing my best. And I kind of thought that was pretty good. And it did hurt
Yeah.
my feelings when she hit me
Mhm.
in the face. And, digging deeper into it, the idea is, okay, if you're consistently saying whenever your child does something that it's about
Yeah.
you, right? Or if you're like, I don't know, mommy doesn't like it when you
Mhm.
look at her funny like that, or mommy's feelings are hurt when if you're overusing
Yes.
that, I could certainly see that being problematic. However, if you're setting the natural boundary or consequence to your child of, when you scream at me, I don't want to play with you. I'm sorry, honey. Like, I need to take a minute and go to the
Mhm.
bathroom. Like, or when you hit me in the face, that hurts. I have to go. Like, or I have to just walk away, collect myself for a second, or I'm going to hold your hands and hug you while you're screaming so you can't
Mhm.
hit me. When you're ready not to hit, I'm going to let go because you can't do that. Or you can't throw yourself down the
Yeah.
stairs. I'm going to hug you until we can go into a safe room. These are very normal, natural consequences. And you can even have, not punishment, but you can actually have more traditional
Yeah.
rewards for good behavior. It doesn't make you a terrible parent. It's not conditioning someone in sort of a Pavlovian
Yeah.
dog way. But it's about the context, right? It's about the context in which you're doing it, how you're doing it, what the rest of your love and attachment is like, what the rest of your dyad is like. And so I just really encourage parents to say, when someone is telling you, don't do this really strictly, or you have to
Mhm.
do this, always kind of ask why. What are you trying to stop or to do? Because maybe that's not relevant to you. Maybe you actually have a really strong connection and your child knows there's nothing transactional and there's nothing that should should make them feel like they're responsible for your emotions. And you can absolutely tell them it hurts your feeling when you get slapped in the face. And you can absolutely use a sticker chart if you need it
Yeah.
for taking doses of medicines. It's not manipulative.
Yeah.
It's all about the context in which it is.
I really appreciated that you had that in the book because I do work with a lot of parents who will say something like, we don't want to use any incentives, or we don't think rewards are good, or we're really picky about what those consequences look like. And I think there's a lot of, back to the point you were making about, like, once you're scrolling on social media and you see all these people say, don't, you're teaching them extrinsic motivation and they're not doing it intrinsically, and all these other things. And the truth is that it's in balance. And like you said, context matters. These can be effective strategies. They can really reach your child in terms of helping them sort of shift or get out of a certain kind of loop of a behavior that might not be successful or helpful for them. But it's when it's out of balance. It's when every single thing you're
Right.
doing is, here's a sticker. It's when every single thing you're working on has a reward, kind of punishment, consequence setup. That's when we start to, like, that pendulum is just swinging too far in the other direction. But I appreciate that, like, you kind of bring it back to the middle of, like, sometimes it's really effective and it's okay and you're not manipulating. I mean, we go to work and we get paid, right? Like, you don't deny your
Right.
paycheck because you intrinsically love your job, right? Like, it's just not the case. So I just appreciated that
And
you
they
had
might
that
be
in
like,
there too. I thought that
and
was really,
it's also just like, think of the science, like they're 2, they're 3, they're 4. I don't know how old this kid is. They don't have that intrinsic motivation yet. Like, they're learning. And so
yes.
you need
Mm-hmm.
to help them. You need to show them. So you're going to model yourself, but there's barely, I'm a 37-year-old. I can't always rely on, like you said, intrinsic motivation
Mm-hmm.
to make me see the importance of what I'm doing. Like, we have reward systems for a reason in society. That's what keeps us kind of accountable to each other. And so again, it's a tool, right? It's one way in which you're going to say, hey, look, I'm going to show you why it's good to do something like brushing your teeth. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you may
Yeah.
not have the mental capacity, you don't, to understand that it's important to how, prevent cavities at the age of 2.5.
Right,
Like,
right.
but it's important to do things that make our bodies healthy in a general way that mommy says is necessary, and that you can trust me. So I'm going to show you that you can trust me to take advice about your health and do something that maybe is annoying but isn't dangerous to your body. It's actually good for your body. And if you want to have a sticker chart for a few weeks to teach that, like, it's not manipulative. It's just a tool to show
Right.
them
I know.
how the world works.
Exactly, exactly. So I really appreciated that part. I was like, "Oh, yay." I'm like, "I love that that was included in the book. That was great." Can we jump over to sleep? Because I feel like this naturally kind
Yeah.
of ties into sort of boundaries, expectations, all the things that we were just kind of talking about in terms of, and then, like, leading us into sleep. So you go into sort of sleep regressions, which I think is so hard for parents of toddlers.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the importance of the bedtime routine and how to implement that?
Yeah. So again, another step back with sleep is only you know what kind of schedule, what kind of arrangement works for your family. And so talking about the
Yeah.
divides of the internet, there's sleep is one of the more dare I say, deranged parts of the parenting internet, where there's sort of this idea that on one hand, I have people saying, like, your kid must sleep on a strict schedule starting 12 hours overnight from day 30 of life, and you have to do exactly like this, and they can never come into your bed at night because that's
Yeah.
bad, and they'll never learn how to sleep on
Mhm.
their own. And that's sort of what I thought going into this. And then of course you do more research and you learn more, and you just use your common sense and you say, well, I think a kid will eventually learn how to sleep. Like, it might be a little easier or harder, it might be a little better if you're stricter in a certain way, because ultimately your goal is that you really want them to sleep on their own, but some parents don't. And the other spectrum of, you have to co-sleep with your baby, you have to co-sleep with your kids, it's also not correct, but that's kind of the only other advice I see on the internet. I see it really as one or another, like, co-sleeping
Mhm.
is natural, you must do it, all families have to be in the same bed for 13 years,
Yeah.
versus, or longer, versus, okay, your kid can never come in, they have to stay in their crib jail for the rest of their lives. And, the reality is only you know what sleeping arrangement's going to work for your family and going to work for you. And it's going to be based on your sleep needs, based on what you want for your kid to have, how soon it's really important for them to sleep independently. But even if you've decided, like I did with my first, it's really important for them to learn that they can sleep independently because that's something I struggled with as a kid. And I really want to make sure that they do that. And it's really important for me to get my sleep. And then even if you decide that, it's not a linear journey. It's not like you do it, you get them to sleep at 4 months, 6 months, whatever, and then they never come into your bed or they never cry in the middle of the night. That's crazy
Mm-hmm.
because that's just not how their bodies work. First of all, we don't do that. How many times do you have a sickness or have something happen to you or have a stressful thing and you wake up in the middle of the night? So it's
Yeah.
it's unrealistic to expect that they won't. And they're a kid, they're a toddler, so they're going to look for you to soothe them or calm them, even if they've been sleep trained, because something's different. They don't feel well, or they're starting to have new cognitive abilities where they are understanding things, developing new fears, new
Yeah.
worries, just new processing. And so, or a new medical thing. So something has changed, and these are just developmentally appropriate, developmentally normal. And to decide that they just won't happen is unrealistic. And to decide that you're going to fight really hard against them, I think causes more stress than it's worth, because
Mm-hmm.
the reality is, in most cases, it goes away with time.
Yeah.
Now, back to the bedtime routine, I do think that's the one thing you really can do if you've decided that having your kid, even if they're sleeping with you sometimes, even if you're not so worried about having them sleep exactly through the night by themselves, a bedtime routine, however you put them to bed, I think is really good. I think the consistency is really helpful. I think, especially in this age where we have so many screens and we have so much sleep issues, we know that we have sleep issues with kids not getting the quality sleep they need. I think just deciding, like, whatever your bedtime routine looks like, that it's going to be consistent, is really helpful for everyone. It's just a basic part of sleep hygiene. And so you don't have to view it as sleep training. You don't have to view it as something rigid or behavioral or unnatural. It's always nice. And so there are definitely things you can do. And that's one of them that I really encourage parents to do that.
Yeah, I loved it. Can you expand on this idea? I might be saying it wrong, but the way you described it in the book was really poignant. I really loved it. The idea of like a tired toddler at bedtime, like you almost don't want them to reach that. My takeaway was like you don't want to get to the point of no return and then be like it's bedtime. So,
Yeah.
can you walk us through like how where that sweet spot is?
Yeah. I just feel like being tired is the enemy of
Yes.
sleep. I think when you're tired, sometimes you reach that point of no return where it's like, oh my God, you're just such an unregulated mess that, like, you're just going to fight it and fight it. I know all parents have had some moment where they're like, oh, my kid's fighting
Mhm.
sleep. And sometimes it's because they're too tired that they're
Totally.
fighting sleep. Of course, if they're not tired, they'll fight it too. So part of that for me is, if you do have a consistent time as best you can, again, with some flexibility, and you do have a consistent routine, and you are responding to your babies or your toddlers kind of sleep cues, then I think you can generally avoid that. And I have found, and I think lots of parents have found, that just sticking to that routine as best you can, just following the cues, not letting kids get too tired, you can avoid like 9 out of 10 bedtime fights. Um, that might be optimistic, but I think you can avoid a lot of them, and just get better quality sleep too.
I love that. I thought that was such a like genius point that I like feel like I intuitively knew, but I was like, I've never heard it phrased that way. And that is so true. Like you don't want to kind of reach that point. And I think that is sort of where the struggle lives for a lot of the families that do
Mm,
run into those bedtime challenges. It's funny because I was thinking about this when we were talking about sort of the noisy space of sleep and how so many parents, there's like two camps. Like you either independent sleep, cry it out, shut the door, just let them self-soothe and figure it
mhm.
out, or it's like absolutely you have to co-sleep, and if you don't, and the attachment won't be there and the bond and all the other, right? So it's like there's just no middle. And I was working with, and you cite this in the book too, about this idea of like really as the parent being ready to sort of to take on, might have even been in the potty training section of like are you kind of in a moment in time where you can really like kind of lock in and kind of work through whatever ups and downs kind of come with this, whether it's sleep training, whether it's potty training. And she was wanting to have her daughter sleep independently in her own bed, and was really struggling with it, and was in the middle of a move and so many different life changes. And I just said to her, like, is like, what happens if she doesn't sleep in her bed? And she says, well, she sleeps with me, and but we all do sleep really well, and she's a great, because she's well rested, she's so much better throughout the day. And I was like, I don't know, it's to me, it's not like top of mind in terms of like, if you asked me what I
Yeah.
could support you with, I just feel like, let that go for a second. Like, I'm not saying don't circle back to it, but maybe just not now. So she said she had met 8 of her friends for dinner, all moms, that night, and just kind of came out with it and was like, hey guys, my daughter's 3 and she's still like, we co-sleep because it's the only way we really get enough rest, and she sleeps really well, and actually so do I. And she said all of the other moms were like, our kids do too. Like, there was so much shame, and these were like really good friends who
Yeah.
wouldn't just say to each other that,
Yeah.
because again, to your point, it's like those two camps of like a good way of sleeping and a bad way of sleeping, and I'm doing air quotes for those of you listening. It's like this, it really elicits a lot of shame in that parenting space. So here you have 8 great friends, these moms who go out together, and they finally like broke down and admitted to each other that they co-sleep. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's kind of like funny and sad all at the same time. So I agree with you that it's just so noisy, and it's so many like righteous opinions in there.
Right. I think one thing it highlights, I just wanted to bring up, was something that we're sort of being sold constantly, that there's a problem with our parenting, right? This is a little bit like
Yeah.
philosophical and bigger picture, but with all this advice available, with all this social media, with this sort of like democracy of information, good and bad, there's just a lot of voices out there, but there's also a lot of voices trying to sell us something, whether
Mhm.
it's, again, some guidance or it's a product or whatever. And you have to make people feel there's a problem if they want to buy something. You have to make them feel like their parenting is broken in some way. And so it's always good to check in with yourself and say, is something broken? Like, for example, do I really want her to sleep in her own bed? Or do I want to, is this actually not a problem and something I'll deal with when I need to deal with it? And then if there is a problem and you say, oh, yeah, this is a problem, well, what is the problem? It might not be what people are telling you. It might be like, I'm actually really worried because I'm worried that she's going to not ever be able to sleep on her own. Okay, well, that actually might
Mhm.
not be the issue. She actually probably will. So we can work through that, and maybe we can just set a deadline versus, I'm not getting any sleep, I'm going to not be able to function at work. Maybe that's a more urgent problem. And then we
Yeah.
should actually address that in a different way versus, I've been told co-sleeping is illegal at age 3. Well,
Yeah.
then that's a problem because someone's giving you bad information. And that's, so is there a problem? What is the problem? If there is so important, because otherwise we're getting sucked into other people's agendas. And it's just, that's what's manipulative, not your parenting, but people trying to sell you something and
Exactly.
make you feel bad.
I totally agree. I know. And it was like I said, it was funny and sad all at the same time, but you're exactly right. And so sometimes I love that process you just described of really sifting through, like, is there a problem, and what is the problem, and is that an urgent problem, like kind of really sitting with some reflective practices about like, what is the real sort of impetus of like, why am I feeling so much stress around this one particular area, that I'm facing. I wanted with that, this is like the perfect way to segue into separation anxiety. I know we're going to come up on time here, but I wanted to talk about this because I think you highlight 2 important points, which is like developmentally why kids do it, at that age, and also like the parenting piece of it, like how it really just pulls at our heartstrings, and kind of
Yeah.
looking at that 2-pronged of like, well, how can we kind of shift a little bit of what's happening inside of us while also helping our child develop those skills to separate, in a way that's healthy. And then also understanding that if they cry when it's time to go somewhere, and that's also okay. So can we kind of rope in maybe mom/parent guilt around, and like where to start for somebody who really struggles with, let's say, school drop off right now? It's a huge thing of like kids adjusting back to the school year and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think it's another case where understanding the why and how it's normal, and in the spectrum of what is healthy and adaptive, and again, the psychology and the physiology of why it's happening developmentally to kids is really important, because then you say, okay, I'm not doing anything wrong. This is something that they have to go through.
Yeah.
They have to learn object permanence. They have to understand that I'm going to come back. They are finally realizing, that I'm the most important person in the world to them. And they don't understand that I'm going to be here in a little bit, or they understand it, but they don't really get it. They haven't seen that pattern yet. And they're, developing all these different types of attachments in their brain. So they are learning a type of secure attachment that they can learn even if you do have periods of separation. So understanding all of that is helpful. That being said, when you go to do it, like you said, it just tears at your heartstrings. And part of it is, because of what we've been through as parents. So just our own experiences with separation. And that's a part that's a little bit, that's good to work through kind of initially to get to what the root is of the situation you're dealing with. So I don't know if it's true for the parents you're working with, but I know for me and the parents I work with and my friends, we put a lot onto the situation. We say that my child
Mm-hmm.
is feeling horrible. They're absolutely feeling abandoned. They're going to be traumatized. And in some cases, maybe they are feeling those really big emotions, and that is something to work through. But in some cases, that's sort of what we're putting on them because that's what we feel right
Mm-hmm.
now, or that's what we remember as a kid in different situations. So I think, again, it's a big call to doing the work on your own responses and having your own mindfulness and your own understanding. But then when it comes to it, it can be hard to separate the excessive from the normal and sort of the okay, my kid's going to cry for a minute, but then they're going to be fine. I think most parents find a way to be okay with that. At least I did, even though it was pretty hard.
Mm-hmm.
But when it becomes a little more intense and longer, I am a big fan of seeking help with that. I think there
Yeah.
are real strategies you can do. If your kid has more anxiety, or if it seems outside the spectrum of normal, like please talk to your pediatrician or a behavioral expert, or someone who, like you can really work through the with parents. And also there are ways to make the transitions better, in any
Mm-hmm.
situation. So the research that they have is that if you have a way to do more gradual transitions, that's great. But we're in the United States and we have like nothing
Mm-hmm.
to give resources in terms of gradual transitions and childcare and all that. So even just working with teachers, working with these caretakers to come up with a consistent, loving routine with a single point person that's called a key person really can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And then remember, you have all sorts of that's sort of the negative space of when you're not with a kid, but you have all this positive space of when you're with your kid. And really remembering that you are building that loving connection. There are ways to pour that in. There is something to be said for, quality over quantity. And I had to remind myself that as a working mom who loves being a working mom. I always want to have my job and I wanted to even have it then. But understanding there were ways that I could build our bond together, that I could talk about separation, about how I always come back. I could make handshakes and songs and all of that. So there are tools to get through it. I think the biggest thing to do, like I said, is to take a step back and ask, is there a problem? And there may
Mm-hmm.
be, separation anxiety is real, and there may be crying that's more than usual or more than you can talk through with a quick song or with a quick hug goodbye. And then what is the problem? Is it how you're feeling about it, but the kid is more or less functional at school? Or is it really something that's affecting your kid and you can work through with your own behaviors, time, and some other strategies to throw in there as well?
Yeah, I love that. And I agree with you. There is like, in some cases, maybe it's not a problem. In some cases, it's the way we're interpreting the event and we're sort of feeling so bad about it that we are using language like, are they feeling abandoned and traumatized and all these things? And the answer is probably no, but I mean, every situation is a little bit different. But when we start to ruminate on that, it does make us feel much worse about the process. And I always feel like kids are so kind of intuitive and they sense and feel so much. So like the more stressed and anxious you are about those
Mhm.
drop offs and those moments of separation, it's like they can almost attune to it. And like I had a
Yeah.
parent I was working with, and her daughter was going to be going into kindergarten. This was a little while back, and it was like summer had just started, and she was like, "Should I start prepping her?" And I was like, "No, like just enjoy summer, like because it's more
Yeah.
about you at this point because you're just so worried about what that's going to look like." But I promise you, if you just kind of let these next couple of months take course, like she just might work through some of that on her own. Like kids are always
Mhm.
developing. We don't always have to be doing something. So, but it was funny. She was just like, you're right. It was totally like my way of wanting to quell my own sort of anxiousness around what
Right,
I
right.
anticipated was going to be happening. And yeah, she actually ended up doing fine going to kindergarten. So
Yeah.
I think there is so much that we can kind of create in those instances that makes it so much harder on us, quite frankly. So, anyways, well, Dr. Diamond, I love the book so much. I'm going to put everything in the show notes, but it's called Eat, Sleep, Tantrum, Repeat. It's such a helpful guide for parents of toddlers. Like I said, it's laid out perfectly. You put a lot of thought and effort into like really knowing how a parent consumes information. And I think it's such a great way of like, you can just open right to the chapter that you need if that's something that you're dealing with. And I mean, I just scratched the surface for those of you listening. There is potty training information in here. There's picky eater. I mean, we could have had a whole episode on just picky eating in terms of like my work and speech therapy and like working through that kind of problem. That's a whole other, issue, but there's so much in
Mhm.
here. There's every single thing that you're going to experience as you parent a toddler and kind of why it's happening. And then you work through that magic of like, okay, but now what? And I love that too, because it gives people tangible tools to put into practice. But for the listeners who want to sort of dig deeper or find you, where can they go?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to get this out there. So come find me on Instagram at Parent Like a Pediatrician. I take your DMs. I try to put content up that shares some of the highlights of the book and just other age groups and other current happenings in pediatrics and parenting. And then my books, both the infant book, Parent Like a Pediatrician, and the toddler book, Eat, Sleep, Tantrum, Repeat, are available literally wherever books are sold.
Amazing. Yeah, both are fantastic. Depends on where you are in your parenting journey, but you'll need them and you will love them. They're honestly, I wish I had them when my kids were little. So, all right, Dr.
Thank
Diamond,
you.
thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful having this time with you.
Thanks again.